What happens when Hollywood's most respected voice of wisdom decides he's had enough of shallow entertainment? On this particular Thursday evening, Morgan Freeman was about to transform Jimmy Kimmel's live television stage into a battlefield of truth, and everyone in the studio could feel the electricity crackling beneath the surface of performative politeness. The studio lights felt hotter than usual, casting sharp shadows across Freeman's distinguished features. He sat rigidly in the guest chair, his hands folded precisely in his lap, those legendary eyes scanning the studio with a mixture of controlled patience and something else, a simmering intensity that made the floor director unconsciously take a step back. Jimmy Kimmel approached with his trademark grin, the kind that had disarmed countless celebrities over the years. But tonight, something was different. "Morgan, we're thrilled to have you here tonight," Kimmel began, leaning forward, with that practiced casual intimacy that had become his trademark. "Your latest documentary on systemic racism has been making waves. I'm sure our audience would love to hear more about what inspired you to take on such a controversial project." Freeman's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. Controversial is an interesting choice of word, Jimmy. I'd call it necessary. The slight emphasis on necessary hung in the air, a subtle challenge that made Kimmel's smile flicker for just a moment. The studio audience watched, sensing something brewing beneath the surface. Freeman wasn't just another celebrity guest, to be entertained or mildly prodded. He was a man with decades of experience, someone who had witnessed and documented the deepest struggles of American society. His recent documentary had exposed raw, uncomfortable truths about racial inequality, challenging institutions, and powerful figures in ways that made many people distinctly uncomfortable. Kimmel pressed on, his questions becoming slightly more pointed. "Some critics have said your approach is too confrontational, that you're not giving enough room for dialogue." The subtext was clear. He was attempting to paint Freeman as aggressive, to undermine the documentary's powerful message. Freeman's right hand resting on the armrest, tensed almost imperceptibly. His voice remained calm, but there was an underlying steel that hadn't been there moments before. "Dialogue requires both parties to listen, Jimmy. My documentary isn't about creating a comfortable conversation. It's about exposing truths that have been comfortably ignored for far too long." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Something was building, a tension that stretched between Freeman and Kimmel like a wire pulled taut. The audience held their collective breath, sensing that this was no ordinary interview. This was going to be something else entirely, a moment of reckoning disguised as entertainment. And Morgan Freeman was just getting started. The dance had begun, and both men knew it. Kimmel's smile never wavered, but something predatory glinted. In his eyes, the look of a host who believed he could dismantle anyone sitting across from him. "Your documentary has stirred up quite a conversation," he said, leaning forward with a calculated casualness that felt more like an invasion than a gesture of intimacy. "Some of your colleagues in Hollywood have been pretty vocal about their reservations." Freeman's gaze didn't waver. Those eyes, which had narrated countless stories, now read Kimmel like an open book. "Reservations," he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "I assume you mean criticisms. Why don't you say what? You mean Jimmy?" A nervous rustle passed through the studio producers. They knew Kimmel's reputation for pushing boundaries, but Freeman was no ordinary guest. He was a titan, an actor whose voice carried the weight of decades of cultural commentary, someone who had witnessed the most profound transformations of American society. "There are rumors," Kimmel pressed, his tone sliding between casual conversation and calculated provocation, "that your activism is making some powerful people uncomfortable. That you're becoming, well, too outspoken." The implication was clear. Know your place, stay in your lane. Freeman's hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, tensed almost imperceptibly. The studio lights caught the subtle movement, a microscopic tell that suggested depths of controlled emotion brewing just beneath the surface. "Uncomfortable," he said softly, "is precisely what people need to be right now." Kimmel's smile never dropped, but something changed in the atmosphere. This was no longer a standard interview. This was a psychological duel, with each man probing for weaknesses, testing boundaries. The studio audience felt it, a collective intake of breath, the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Your recent statements about institutional racism, Kimmel continued, have been pretty controversial. Some say you're alienating potential allies by being too aggressive. The word aggressive was a calculated weapon, designed to provoke, to paint Freeman as unreasonable. But Freeman had spent a lifetime navigating such rhetorical minefields. His response was surgical. Allies who require me to soften the truth are not allies at all, he said, his voice a low, resonant instrument of precision. Comfort is the enemy of progress. The producers exchanged glances. This was not going according to the usual script, and Morgan Freeman was just getting started. The moment crystallized, a heartbeat where everything changed. Kimmel had finally found the trigger, the one question that would shatter Freeman's carefully constructed composure. "Let's talk about your documentary's funding," Kimmel said, his voice taking on an edge of mock investigative journalism. "Some of your corporate sponsors have been questioning whether your approach is too radical. They're worried about alienating potential donors." The implied threat was clear: tone it down or risk losing support. Freeman's response came not in words but in a look. Those eyes, which had narrated stories of hope, of struggle, of human resilience, suddenly blazed with an intensity that made the entire studio fall silent. It was the look of a man who had witnessed decades of systemic injustice, who had spent a lifetime watching promises of change dissolve into empty rhetoric. "Radical," Freeman repeated, the word emerging like a thunderclap. "Radical is watching generations of people denied their fundamental human dignity. Radical is believing that silence is somehow more comfortable than truth." Kimmel tried to maintain his trademark smirk, but it was faltering. This was no longer an interview, this was a reckoning. "My documentary," Freeman continued, his voice gathering power with each word, "isn't about making people comfortable. It's about exposing the uncomfortable truths that this country has hidden for far too long. If speaking about systemic racism makes me radical, then I will wear that label with pride." The studio audience was no longer breathing. Some leaned forward, others sat frozen, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond a typical talk show moment. The producers exchanged nervous glances. This was going off script in the most spectacular way possible. Kimmel attempted to regain control. "But surely you understand the need for nuance, for nuance?" Freeman's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Nuance is the language of those who benefit from the status quo. Nuance is how injustice continues to breathe, how systems of oppression maintain their grip." He leaned forward, and in that moment, Morgan Freeman was no longer just an actor or a narrator. He was a force of nature, a living testament to every struggle, every moment of resistance that had defined the American experience of race. "I didn't make this documentary to be liked," Freeman said, his voice a low, resonant instrument of truth. "I made it to be heard." The camera never lies except when it does, and Morgan Freeman was about to expose every single mechanism of that lie. "You want to talk about my documentary," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the studio. "Let's talk about the real documentary happening right now. This," he gestured between himself and Kimmel, "is the performance. This is how media truly operates." Kimmel's smile had long since vanished. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he was no longer in control of the narrative, a feeling entirely foreign to him. Freeman's critique was surgical, each word a precise instrument dissecting the very mechanics of entertainment media. "These talk shows," he continued, "are not interviews. They're choreographed encounters designed to reduce human complexity to digestible sound bites. You don't want truth, you want spectacle." The studio audience was no longer passive. Some leaned forward, others exchanged knowing glances. This was no longer just an interview. This was a public deconstruction of an entire media ecosystem. "Every question is calculated," Freeman explained, his voice a masterclass in controlled fury. "Not to understand, but to provoke, to create a moment, to generate clicks, views, controversy. The human being becomes secondary to the content. The story becomes a product, and the storyteller becomes a commodity." Kimmel attempted to interject, but Freeman was relentless. "You've built an entire industry on reducing people to their most vulnerable moments. Celebrities are not human beings to you. Their content generators. Their pain, their complexity, their actual stories are secondary to whatever narrative you want to construct. The cameras continued rolling, capturing a moment that would redefine television. Freeman wasn't just critiquing Kimmel, he was indicting an entire system of media manipulation. "This isn't journalism," he said, his gaze sweeping across the studio. "This isn't even entertainment. This is a performance of power, a systematic erosion of genuine human connection, packaged and sold as insight." For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel looked genuinely afraid, not of Freeman physically, but of the intellectual onslaught that was dismantling everything he represented. "You want to know why my documentary matters?" Freeman's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Because it refuses to play by these rules. Because it insists on seeing humanity in its full, complex, uncomfortable truth." The studio had become a classroom. The talk show had transformed into a profound lesson about media, power, and the fundamental human right to be seen authentically. Millions of Americans were about to witness something unprecedented, a moment when the carefully constructed walls of media performance would come crashing down. The live broadcast had transformed. No longer a controlled interview, it had become a public trial of the entire entertainment media landscape. Freeman stood now, his full height commanding the stage, no longer confined to the guest chair. Kimmel looked small, diminished, a man suddenly confronting the full weight of his professional sins. "This isn't about me," Freeman said, his voice carrying beyond the studio walls, reaching living rooms across the nation. "This is about how we consume stories, how we reduce human beings to entertainment, how we strip away dignity in the name of ratings." Social media erupted. Millions of phones lit up, capturing, sharing, commenting. This was no longer just a television moment. It was a cultural earthquake. Kimmel attempted one final deflection. "We're live, Morgan. This isn't the place for—" "This is exactly the place," Freeman interrupted, his voice a thunderclap of moral clarity. "If not here, where? If not now, when? These studios, these cameras, they're not just tools of entertainment. They're instruments of power." The studio crew stood frozen. Camera operators continued filming, caught between professional protocol and the raw authenticity unfolding before them. Some looked terrified, others looked inspired. Freeman's gaze swept across the studio, then directly into the cameras. Every young artist, every journalist, every person who has been told to compromise their truth for the sake of comfort. This is for you. We are not commodities, we are not content. We are human beings with stories that deserve to be told with respect, with dignity. The silence was profound. Not the manufactured silence of a television set, but the kind of quiet that precedes a fundamental shift in understanding. "You want to know why representation matters?" Freeman continued. "Because every time you reduce a person's experience to a sound bite, you're not just silencing an individual. You're erasing entire histories, entire communities." Kimmel had become a peripheral figure in his own show. Freeman was no longer just speaking to him, or even to the studio audience. He was speaking to a nation. "This is what accountability looks like," Freeman said, his voice a blend of fury and hope. Not performative apologies, not manufactured. Moments of reconciliation, but genuine, unfiltered truth. The cameras kept rolling, and America was watching. The aftermath was a tornado of media chaos that no crisis management team could have anticipated. Within hours of Freeman's televised takedown, the landscape of late-night entertainment had been irrevocably transformed. In the sterile conference rooms of the network headquarters, executives moved like panicked ants. Screens displayed endless social media feeds, trending hashtags, and clips of Freeman's confrontation that were being shared millions of times per minute. The network's damage control strategy was crumbling faster than they could draft a press release. "This isn't just about one interview," muttered Robert Lansing, the network's chief communications officer, his voice a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. "Freeman has exposed something much larger. Social media had become a battleground. Celebrities who had long suffered similar treatment began sharing their own stories. Journalists and media critics dissected every moment of the confrontation. Freeman's words had struck a nerve that ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Kimmel, once the undisputed king of late-night entertainment, found himself on the defensive. His usual arsenal of jokes and deflections had been stripped away, leaving only a vulnerable figure struggling to maintain relevance. "We're looking at a complete restructuring of how celebrity interviews are conducted," one network analyst said, studying the rapidly changing metrics. Freeman hasn't just called out Kimmel, he's challenged an entire system. The power of individual truth-telling had never been more apparent. Freeman's unscripted moment had become a cultural inflection point, revealing the systemic vulnerabilities that had long been hidden behind polished television sets and carefully managed narratives. Industry insiders began to whisper. How many other interviews had been similarly manipulated? How many stories had been reduced to cheap entertainment? Freeman had opened a Pandora's box that couldn't be closed. "This goes beyond Kimmel," a veteran television producer remarked during an emergency meeting. "This is about the fundamental way we create and consume media." The network's legal team was already preparing for potential fallout. Advertisers began to distance themselves, sensing a shift in public sentiment. What had begun as a single interview was rapidly becoming a referendum on media ethics. Freeman himself remained silent, but his silence was more powerful than any statement. He had said everything that needed to be said, and now the world was listening. The media circus was in full swing, and nothing would be the same again. The quiet of his study was a stark contrast to the media storm that had consumed the past 48 hours. Morgan Freeman sat by the window, a single lamp casting a soft glow on the walls lined with photographs, moments of history, of struggle, of triumph. His longtime friend and confidant, Marcus Reynolds, sat across from him, the silence between them heavy with understanding. They had known each other long enough that words were often unnecessary. "I didn't plan it," Freeman finally said, his voice soft but carrying the same resonance that had captivated millions. "Not exactly, but I've been preparing for that moment my entire life." Marcus nodded. They both understood the weight of those words, the accumulation of decades of witnessing, of experiencing, of fighting silent battles long before this public confrontation. "They'll come for you," Marcus said. It wasn't a warning, but a statement of fact. The industry doesn't forgive people who speak truth to power. Freeman's laugh was quiet, almost sad. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm asking for recognition, for understanding." He gestured to the photographs around him, images of civil rights moments, of cultural transformations, of quiet heroes who had never been given their due. "This isn't about me," he continued, echoing his televised statement. "It's about creating space. Space for stories that have been silenced, space for voices that have been marginalized." The exhaustion was visible now, not just physical, but the bone-deep weariness of a lifetime of resistance. Yet beneath that exhaustion was something else, a resolve, a quiet triumph. "Every time someone tells you to be quiet," Freeman said, more to himself than to Marcus, "they're admitting the power of your voice. Every attempt to silence reveals their fear." Marcus watched his friend. This was more than just a response to a talk show confrontation. This was the culmination of a lifetime of fighting, through film, through activism, through the simple act of existing with dignity in a world that had long tried to diminish that dignity. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. Freeman's gaze returned to the photographs, each a testament to moments of change, of resistance, of hope. "We keep telling the story," he said simply. "We always keep telling the story." 6 months after that fateful night, the ripples of Freeman's confrontation had become a tidal wave of transformation. Talk shows began reimagining their interview formats. Hosts who once relied on gotcha moments and invasive questioning now approached guests with a newfound respect. The unwritten rules of celebrity interviews had been rewritten, not by network executives, but by a single moment of unfiltered truth. Young journalists and media students studied the confrontation like a master class in integrity. Clips of Freeman's takedown were analyzed in classrooms, discussed in media ethics seminars, shared across social platforms as a defining moment of modern media resistance. "It was never about me," Freeman told a small gathering of media activists and young journalists. It was about creating a space for authentic conversation, about refusing to be reduced to a commodity. His documentary, already powerful, now carried an additional weight. Institutions that had previously been hesitant began to engage more deeply with its content. Conversations about representation, about the mechanics of media, about the power of storytelling, they had all fundamentally shifted. Kimmel's career never fully recovered. Other talk show hosts began to re-examine their approaches, recognizing the thin line between entertainment and exploitation. The culture of performative media had been challenged at its very core, but for Freeman, this was never about personal victory. It was about opening doors, about creating possibilities for those who would come after. The younger generation of actors, journalists, and activists now had a blueprint, a moment that demonstrated the power of speaking truth, regardless of the platform. "We are not content," Freeman would often repeat, a phrase that had become a rallying cry for those challenging media narratives. "We are storytellers. We are human beings." Universities began developing new media ethics courses. Documentarians found themselves with more support, more understanding. The ecosystem of storytelling was transforming, one conversation at a time, and yet Freeman remained characteristically humble. When asked about his impact, he would simply smile and say, "Change happens when we refuse to be silent, when we recognize that our stories matter." The confrontation had been more than a moment. It was a movement, a reminder that true power lies not in the loudest voice, but in the most authentic one.